Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly video series. I'm Peyton, and I am joined by the ladies again, Yaila and Corey. And today we have such a fascinating topic for you. We are talking about spiritual awakenings. So if you are part of the spiritual or intuitive community, you have probably had a spiritual awakening yourself. But right now, we are going through a period on Earth where there are mass awakenings. So we thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about what a spiritual awakening is. What does that even mean? What did our spiritual awakenings look like? And maybe share some tips with you to help you out a little bit if you are newer to the awakening process, because it can be a little overwhelming if you don't know what to do with all of this new information and consciousness that is really kind of taking over all of us. Our awareness and just our beingness on the planet is being elevated. So we wanted to just help you out if you're newer to the spiritual awakening process. So that is the topic of today's video. And today I would like to start with you, Yaila. How would you describe what a spiritual awakening even is, in case people don't know whether they have had one? And what did your awakening process look like? Was it easy? Was it not so easy? What do you have to say?
Thank you, Peyton. I love this topic because I feel like this is a question a lot of new students and clients will ask if they're in their journey themselves. The best way I think I can describe a spiritual awakening is really connecting to yourself as a spiritual being, your connection to your energetic self, your connection to all that is, your connection to the universe, to the divine. And so when you awaken to who you truly are at your core and your connection to all that is, I feel like that's kind of a general way to say a spiritual awakening. For me, it can show up in a lot of different ways for people. I feel like my personal journey has come through in waves of awakening, I want to say. Probably the first time I realized I was tapping into something more awarenesses about myself as a person, as a being, was when I took a leadership course. And it wasn't necessarily a spiritual course, but it was a leadership course on how to be truly sovereign in your own day-to-day life and your own journey. And from that, I learned about the different beliefs and stories I told myself about situations, about people, about growing up, and kind of got clued in on where those beliefs came from and where those thoughts came from and how I acted based off of those old beliefs. And so when you're a little kid and you're trying to understand the world around you, there's other information that gets put in your space from your parents' level of consciousness, your community's level of consciousness. So every person and situation you connect with as you're growing up and understanding the world creates these beliefs. And so when you start to see yourself as more of a spiritual being, right? So you're starting to look at the world through a different view, meaning I call them lenses or veils that get put into our space. So let me give an example. Let's say you have a belief that you can't do something. You're not able to do. I used to not think I was a runner. I never thought I could run a half marathon. I didn't think I could run more than 3 miles because that's all I ever did. And I didn't really try. And then I started, my family wasn't really that kind of family. We didn't do those types of things. And I started to try different things going out. But once I started taking a leadership course, I started to look at when I was putting myself in different situations of growth, I had to question my beliefs because I could see levels of where I could go further. And I could look at myself as more the observer than just running on default in situations. And that kind of started my awareness that there's a different level to myself than what I think I was taught about. So that's kind of the beginning of my spiritual awakening. Just realizing the beliefs I was telling myself growing up were maybe not really the truth. There's different levels to that. And so a veil in your space could be you're not good enough, you're not worthy, not tall enough, not smart enough, not pretty enough, not nice enough, whatever the things are that we start to tell ourselves about situations growing up, we start to believe it. And we start to think it's the truth. And we start to look at the world, if we feel like we're not smart enough, we might give our power away to other people to make decisions for us. And so when I talk about different veils, these are the things that get put to our space for one way, shape, or form. When you have a spiritual awakening, you start to connect to your true self. You start to connect to that part of you, the observer, of looking at other possibilities, looking at, well, is that really your belief? Are you limited by not knowing? Nutrition background too, that was another level of spiritual awakening where I, growing up in school is like, you eat like these types of foods. And then I went through a coaching program and I learned like, oh, your body tells you what feels good for it and what doesn't. And that changes and that evolves and there's different seasons. And so for me, spiritual awakening is really tapping into the universe, the divine, your higher self, the creator, all that is, and you are co-creating with those different levels that you're a piece of. I feel like us as humans, we are pretty much like the little pinky finger of the universe. We're just a part of it, but there's so much more levels to who we are as a spirit. There's other souls that we connect with. There's other levels of consciousness and dimensions that we connect with. And in your spiritual awakening process, you start to open your awareness to those different levels of consciousness. So where it's evolved to now is after taking specific classes around energy work and looking at what filters are in my space, what beliefs are in my space, what energy is in my space. It's not even mine. And having the awareness that I can actually call the shots and keep what I want in my space there, release what I don't. And my experience in this human life, I get to change and call more shots and recreate things and learn and grow. And it's all connected to that bigger piece of me, that higher self that is also connected to the universe, the divine, to other spiritual beings. So, if I were to bring spiritual awakening into one little thing, it's really about your level of connection to your soul and to who you really want to be as a soul, and your connection to all that is, your connection to your thoughts, your beliefs, other people, what the world reflects around you. And you always have a choice on new levels and ways of thinking, believing, and creating in your space. So when I think of spiritual awakening, that's kind of what first comes to mind. But how about you, Corey?
Oh, Yaila, that was brilliantly put. Okay, end of video. No. Couldn't have said it better myself. A spiritual awakening. It's interesting because when we talked about doing the topic of spiritual awakening, immediately what I energetically saw was just boom, right? And I've heard a lot of stories and from a lot of my clients and students about sometimes just being struck awake in their spiritual awakening, because oftentimes there's a spiritual awakening that happens when there's trauma. Say a car accident, and maybe you went to the other side for a little while. That's a spiritual awakening. Or when we get into a state of PTSD or trauma, whether it's a car accident, something that jolts us. Oftentimes you hear about spiritual awakenings then. And that's, it's interesting because we were, when we were talking about it, and I listening to you, I started thinking, really, wow, when was my spiritual awakening? And when Yaila, when you said, there's some of them that have gone along, the journey, little ones that are ones that happen. And I agree with you there. I mean, I was born telepathic, so obviously there was a connection there. But I'm a twin, so this to me was just normal. And the beliefs that I loved how you talked about, Yaila, about the beliefs, because having beliefs and being brought up, I was brought up that, I have a twin brother, and so he got to do a lot of the sports. He had certain roles in the family. I had certain roles. And during my lifetime, this lifetime, I should say, as far as I know, I kept trying to fill that female role that I was brought up with. And really, not that there was anything wrong with it, but I always had this inner, what? Wait, huh? And so I guess I've always had that little knowing voice that kind of questioned everything. And every time I tried to go along with whatever was going on, something would happen. So I had a car accident when I was 20. No, I was 19 or 20, probably 19 or 20. And the fact that I actually lived through it, and I had no idea. I just had no idea. And then there are times where, things have just happened in my life. But the last big one, I have to say, was my last relationship. My husband and I got a divorce. But before that actually happened, the spiritual awakening was at least a year into the marriage. And suddenly I was just being jolted by like, no, that doesn't sound right. No, that doesn't sound right. Wait, no, that doesn't sound right. And at the time, I was just being divinely guided, and I didn't know. I did not know that I was telepathic. And so words would come out of, his mouth, and I knew that he was lying. But when I left, I could feel when he was coming into town. I could feel when he left town. I could feel when he drove down the street. I could feel when he was near. I could feel when he was far. And so from that trauma, and that's it, oftentimes you will hear people that when there was a trauma, that was their spiritual awakening. And that was one of my big spiritual awakenings. That when we have that trauma, our pineal gland just expands. And it's really for survival, because our higher selves, angels, God, whatever you want to call it, is helping us out, whether we realize it or not. And at times, I believe that is a spiritual awakening. When trauma happens and all your senses turn on and all the forces come to help you get out of what a situation that you shouldn't be in, or that's not for your highest and greatest good. So that was really one of my big spiritual jolting, I call it, spiritual awakening. But years prior to that, I used to drink. Because of my upbringing, and not totally because of my upbringing. Part of it's genetic, but I had a problem with alcohol and drugs, and I ended up getting sober. Basically, I ended up getting sober, and I was young. I was a young chickie then, and that was a spiritual awakening. I was on my Saturn return, my first Saturn return, and everything that happened was really divinely guided. And that's what introduced me to a spiritual way of life, because I had no idea. I didn't have any idea who I was, what I liked, what I didn't like. And so that was really like a soft spiritual awakening. Yes, the process to get there was not so pretty, but I was willing to nothing was working. And so with my clients and students, I know that sometimes that spiritual awakening can have anxiety. And a lot of the people that I work with, I talk to them about a spiritual awakening. And that even though it feels like a jolting, it's the biggest gift that could ever be given to you. Because that is the opportunity to get to know ourselves on a spiritual level, on a cosmic level. And really, the beliefs, that was a big one too. Going, wait, do I really believe that? Wait, I don't really believe that. Does that really work for me? No. So instead of fighting it, recreating it. And sometimes it takes that jolt. And that's the experience I have with a lot of my clients and some of my students and myself. So, but it is an amazing, amazing journey. And so that's why I got into, classes that, were geared around energy work and what is energy and how does it work. And, now teaching it because it was so life-changing. So there are little spiritual awakenings along the way. And I'm glad I kind of got my big jolt one over with. Not that everybody has it, but I did. So what have you got, Peyton?
I love that. And this is one of my favorite topics. I love hearing everyone's story because it unfolds so differently for everyone. And so when I think of, or when I hear someone talking about their spiritual awakening, or when I think of mine, the way I kind of think of it as is when you change totally the way you look at the world, because that's kind of how it played out for me, where my whole way of looking at reality just got turned on its head. And so for me, it's kind of, I kind of equate it with a breakthrough of consciousness, where you just start to look at everything a little differently. There are those things that you used to just take for granted that is how the world worked. And all of a sudden you're like, that doesn't sound quite right to me anymore. I don't think I really believe that. And so that is kind of how spiritual awakening kind of played out in my experience. And mine was exactly what you're talking about, Corey. Mine was the jolt. There was no subtlety to this, no guessing what was going on. It was like being hit by lightning. And it was so distinct. I remember the exact day and time that it happened. It was February 7th, 2007, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It was that dramatic of a life-changing event. And it's so funny because what happened is I was watching the Oprah show, which I never watched because I worked. So I was practicing as a lawyer. So I was never home when the show was on. So I really had gotten away from watching Oprah. And she did a show on the law of attraction. And that book, The Secret, from way back when, and I had never heard of any of this, had never heard of the book. I just happened to tune into this episode. And by the time the show was over, my whole body was vibrating. Like all the hair stood up on my arms. It turned everything I thought I understood about reality absolutely upside down. And for about 3 weeks, I felt like electricity was moving through my body. I was absolutely electrified because this was so different from anything I had ever been taught. This whole idea that we control our reality and we can create what we want and we can make things go away if we don't like them. That was all completely foreign to me. So that was actually what was my spiritual awakening, because it opened a door that has never been closed since. And so mine was one of those lightning bolt type situations that wasn't precipitated by trauma, which definitely can happen. But for me, it was stumbling onto new information. And I just knew at every level of my being that it was the truth. I just knew it. And that was the first time I hadn't just memorized what was fed to me as being the truth. So, for me, it was a very, very strong and memorable experience. And so for me, I like what you said, Yaila, because I totally agree with this. For me, my spiritual awakening and what I see in so many of my clients is that it goes in phases. And so for me, the first phase was changing my awareness and my way of looking at the world. And that phase was really fun for me. It was a couple years where I was learning and I was finding all these great new authors and learning all these great new concepts. It was really exciting. But then what happens is as you're learning all this great new stuff and your consciousness is rising, so is your vibration. What happens? Everything in you that is not healed comes to the surface. And so for me, the second phase of my awakening is what I think of as the healing phase. And that went on for a good, I'd say, 5 years. And that's where it is not quite so fun as the first phase, because all of your stuff comes bubbling to the surface. So all those things that you haven't confronted, that you don't know exist in yourself, those limiting beliefs, they all come rushing to the surface. And so that's why so many of the clients that I work with them at this phase. They've gone through the awakening, they understand the concepts, and now it's time to apply it to their life so that because you can kind of go through a phase at this point where your whole life kind of falls apart. That's something that I hear so many people talking about. They're like, I have all this great knowledge and everything is going completely to crap. And that's one of the most common things that I hear, because again, everything comes to the surface to be dealt with. And so for me, the second phase of healing was a little bumpy. It was a little rough. And so for me, what was so important about that phase of the spiritual awakening process, and the three of us talk about this all the time, getting teachers and training. That is what moved me through that painful part of the process, because confronting all your stuff isn't necessarily fun. Doing the shadow work, some of that heavy stuff that we've talked about in so many videos, kind of comes in at this phase, because now is where you're applying this new knowledge to your actual life. So to me, this stage is so important to find great teachers and great tools, because they can help you move through some of the uncomfortableness and give you kind of a new way of working. So teachers were kind of my salvation during that healing phase. I was all about needing teachers and guidance, because it can just take you a lot longer if you're trying to figure it out yourself. So we are all such huge proponents of teachers and training. And then for me, as you kind of move out of that really intense healing phase, for me, the next step has been what my guides call mastery, or the integration phase. And that's where things just start to calm down a little bit. You've worked with your teachers for a couple of years, you've got tools, so you're not quite as rolled every time something new comes up for you to confront. So rather than being brought to your knees, curled up in a ball on the floor, which a lot of us can relate to from the healing phase, by the time you move into the integration phase, you go to your tools more quickly. As soon as you feel something coming up, you take responsibility for it, you bring out the tools, and you have more self-love and compassion for yourself, because you know it's just something else to move through. So for me, this is the stage where you start to be of service with what you've learned. So for me, once you start to reach that stage of mastery and integration, you kind of have your feet on the ground a little bit after that healing phase. And now it's time, I kind of look at it as that's the time then to be of service to those who are coming along after you. So my awakening experience has kind of been a phased journey. And if you're in that rough part of it, my advice is always just to be more loving with yourself, because it's easy to slip into judgment and frustration when it's not fun. So for me, coming back to self-love can help you move through some of the bumpier phases of it. So girls, I'd like to always ask this: what is one piece of advice you would have for someone who is brand new to their awakening and is a little overwhelmed by the whole process? How about you, Yaila? What would you say?
The number one thing I would say is to get support by somebody who does this type of work. Can't be a more advocate, and there's tons of different ways to go about it, whether working with an individual coach or taking a class or doing some type of energy work, Reiki, learning about the elements of actual energy, like whoever does it on a personal level or teaching level. I'd say that'd be my number one suggestion. So you actually get tools on how to work with this, because like you said, Peyton and Corey, it's going to go through phases. And that's why I believe my spiritual awakening has happened in different phases. And it would go just like what you're saying, Peyton. It's like you have these new beliefs that pop up, these new awarenesses, and you start to question, you have curiosity, and then you kind of go through this like swirly phase, relationships change, my job changed twice. You know, there's like these big life events that adjust and change, and it's uncomfortable, and you're looking at these deeper things about yourself. And then after you kind of make it through that, and then you go into this integration phase, and things start to be more hopeful and start to align more and fall into place. And then I went right through that cycle again, through like the next level, the next level. So the thing that really I think has moved me the quickest, because those first couple of mild awakenings were very slow and like took years to process through. When I actually started going through classes, what would take years or months sometimes would take weeks or days. And I'm at the point now where I can literally shift through something within a couple hours. I mean, stuff that would take me down for months, I can move through in a couple hours because I've learned the tools and I had that support. So that would be my number one recommendation on that. How about you, Corey?
Well, you know, I agree with you as well, Yaila. Another piece of advice would be don't give up and be easy on yourself. So let's just say that, you know, your world's turned upside down, or you start seeing things that resonate with you, but not what you were brought up with. And let's just say you go and see somebody and it helps, but maybe doesn't resonate. Go somewhere else, you know, pick something else, you know, sometimes it might take some Reiki, sometimes it might take, you know, an energy worker, sometimes it might take a channeler, but keep an open mind, because as you continue to you don't give up, but you continue to just keep on the path, you know, the universe will guide you. And sometimes it takes a couple places, but I agree with you, Yaila, as well. We all do. We're big advocates on, you know, finding a class, whether it's a workshop or, you know, whether it's Reiki or any of those places where you can take classes. Yeah, I mean, I chose to be in a class that, you know, was 6 months long. Actually, we all did. Come to think of it, we all did. And in that 6 months, it was a steady, you know, once a week, every week. So there was a lot of movement, but don't do it alone. Don't do it alone. Get help, get support, and don't give up. Don't give up on yourself. And don't think that you're crazy, even though you might feel it. And be easy on yourself. You know, and find people. You know, when you go to classes, you find like-minded people who are going through similar, if not the same thing. And you build a group, you build a tribe, you build a community for yourself. I know that's what we've all done, and it's been life-changing. So don't give up on yourself. Don't give up. That's my piece of advice. How about you, Peyton?
No shock, completely agree with both of you. For me, I always come back to have teachers. Find the teachers, the coaches, the classes that resonate with you. Because when I first had my awakening, for the first probably 7 or 8 years, I did it by myself because there was no other way to do it. You know, in 2007 to 2010, we didn't have the internet resources that we have now. It was hard to find teachers. You know, there was 1 or 2 people out there talking about this. And so you had to kind of do it yourself. And then when I noticed, you know, as the couple years went by, and especially I moved to the West Coast, where there were a lot more options than in the Deep South, what I noticed as I started to work with every kind of teacher, you know, I did group classes, I did conferences, I worked one-on-one with people. I made more progress in 6 months than I had in the previous 7 or 8 years. So for me, find a teacher and always have teachers. I don't think we ever outgrow teachers. And so there's always someone farther down the road from you who's been where you are. And again, I second what Yaila said. Make sure your teachers are teaching you tools. Information and concepts only get you so far. For me, you have to know the tools to move the energy. That's where the change happens, at least for me. And what I see in my clients is you've got to know how to move energy and have the actual concrete tools to do that. Once I had that, like you said, Yaila, I can move through things that would have taken me down for years. And I can do it in a matter of days, worst case scenario usually. So, and that's all because I've used the tools and I keep learning more tools, bigger tools, stronger tools. And so that's what I say, especially if you're struggling with your awakening, there are tools and teachers who can really take a lot of that weight off your shoulders. So absolutely, teachers are invaluable. So
can I add one thing? One thing else I would add to that. I know when I was in my journey, I thought there was something wrong with me, and I thought I was being punished sometimes, especially when I was going through that hard part. So I love what you said, Corey, as far as like, don't give up. Because there were some times where it was really easy, and I'm kind of seeing it now in the collective, because as a collective, we're having waves of different awakenings for people right now. And it's easy to have a thought that pops up and you feel a little bit hopeless about a situation, because what's coming up is I've started to change my belief that everything is happening for me, not to me. And maybe you've heard that expression before. So if it's happening for you, how can you benefit from this? How can you move through this? How can you take it to the next level that you're truly wanting to go? So if you're feeling like you're being punished or there's something wrong with you, I definitely recommend don't let yourself spiral down that hopelessness. See if you can look at it another way of, okay, if this is happening for me, for my benefit, how could it be for my benefit, even if everything around me is crashing down? Because there's been some rough, my awakening itself wasn't this crazy lightning bolt, but the crashing down definitely was a hard fall. A lot of times it was a whap, a lot of times of like nothing, everything just like dissolved. So if you're feeling like you're going through some rough stuff, just know you're not being punished. You didn't do anything wrong. It's just you're clearing away what is no longer serving you, and sometimes it has to be like rip that band-aid off, and so you can just go. So that would be my last little thing to add.
I love that.
Yeah.
Because you can wonder when you're going through this. It can be unlike anything that you've seen other people around you going through. You may be the only spiritual person or the first one to wake up. And then it can be doubly kind of frustrating and scary because you don't really know what's going on. So always more self-love and always more compassion for yourself and for anyone else who is part of the story around it. Are always good. I think good ways to go. Go back to the love, I always say. Well, thank you so much, girls. What a great conversation. I love hearing people's awakening stories. It just shows that we're really all in this together and that we can all support each other. So we hope you enjoyed this video. We are so glad that you have been tuning into our videos. Please let us know what topics you would like us to address. We do this for you, and we can't wait to see you on the next video. Have a great night. Bye.
Bye.